To all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. I am Will, your host, and I welcome you to this series where I am re-watching all 63 Disney animated films in chronological order. We are on number 6, which means the next movie up is Saludos Amigos, or the first film in the wartime or packaged film era. If you want to know more about the unofficial eras of Disney animation, you can go check out on my earlier episode where I describe those different eras. Let's start talking about Saludos Amigos by talking a little bit about its history as I do in this series. In 1940, so when the world was starting to get into World War II, there was a newly established government assignment called the CIA, not to be confused with the CIA, but the CIA, which stands for the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, was established. The person who was this coordinator was Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller organized what was called goodwill tours. These tours were meant as a countermeasure to growing Axis powers in Southern and Central America, as some governments down there had close relations to the Axis powers. They went to notable names of Hollywood elites to go on these tours, but they also went to Hollywood to try and get studios to add more Latin American culture to their films. These original tours actually didn't go over too well, and in fact, they had the opposite effect than what they were looking for, as they were often viewed as lazy attempts to gain favor. So, what was next for Nelson Rockefeller and the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs? Well, of course, Walt Disney was next. It seemed a very logical choice, as Mickey, as well as other Disney characters, were wildly popular in this part of the world. Walt was against this idea at first of doing one of these goodwill tours, because he felt like he wasn't the kind of person to shake hands or make connections in a way that could stop a war from progressing. The government didn't want him to do that typical ambassador stuff. Rather, they came to Walt and they wanted him and a team to go to South America to do research and come up with content for possible future projects. It did help convince Walt that the government was going to pay for this trip. It didn't take Walt very long to agree to this and decide on those who he wanted to bring on the trip with him. In total, there were about 18 people, 15 employees, mainly a story and concept artist, with one musician, Walt's wife, and Walt himself. Walt didn't want to do the typical stops people made on these goodwill tours. He didn't want to go near the embassies. He wanted to dive right in deep into each of the cultures of the countries he was visiting. For example, they quickly learned the significance of a papagayo, I think it's how it's pronounced, which is a Brazilian parrot in the culture. His team spent times in zoos and museums to quickly build a character based on this parrot, which we know as Jose, which of course he shows up a little bit later in this film. A fun story from the tour in Brazil is actually when the plane stopped in a town called Belém in Brazil for refueling. Somehow the word got out that Walt was going to be there, and hundreds of school kids were there specifically to see Walt Disney. Bill Cottrell, Walt's brother-in-law who was on the trip, said, quote, "They might not have known who the president of their own country was, but they all knew who Walt Disney was," end quote. Another story involving kids has conflicting reports on the exact details, but both reports have the same vibe. In Argentina, there was a moment when Walt was on stage in front of a bunch of kids presenting. Running out of the Spanish that he knew, Walt started to stand on his head. The other account of this story is a group of kids were told that they were going to meet someone important, and then when Walt Disney came in on stage, he walked in on his hands. All 18 people who went on this trip weren't together for this entire journey. They split up to cover more ground and to learn more about each country, like Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru, and Brazil. Saludos Amigos is comprised of 4 animated segments. Lake Titicaca is the first one. Pedro is the second one. El Gaucho Goofy is the third one. And the fourth one is a short called Aquarela de Brazil. The original contract between Disney and the government actually was to make 12 animated shorts. But much like when they were starting to make Fantasia, they realized that the purpose of these animated shorts would be more effective if they turned them into movies rather than releasing them as individual shorts. One reason was movies could be made more available than just shorts. This movie was actually really well received in the areas of the globe that mattered the most, meaning South and Central America. Some theaters had a policy where you couldn't show the same movie back to back, and that was discontinued so they could show more showings of Saludos Amigos. And in one account, there was actually an audience member who threatened to burn down the theater if the movie wasn't shown again. So maybe not exactly what Walt wanted to achieve with people threatening arson for the love of his movies, but at least the passion for the movie was certainly there. And so my thoughts on this movie are, I feel like Saludos Amigos is a movie that depends heavily on knowing the context and the reason as to why it was made. I have a feeling that if someone watched this movie blindly, not knowing the context, they might get a little bored with it rather quickly. There isn't anything that stands out as Disney magic, because even when you think about the other film that's made of a bunch of shorts, Fantasia, you still had a scene with Mickey that felt Disney inspired. But with this movie being made to educate the audience, at times it definitely did feel like you are watching something that is required viewing at school. With that being said, I feel like Saludos Amigos can still provide a very charming time with those that watch it. Let's talk about the first short titled Lake Titicaca that follows Donald as a tourist while exploring the lake and the surrounding areas. This short is structured very much like a travel journal, with the narrator describing what can be done in the area, and while he is describing these things, you see Donald doing all of these things. But as we may guess, since the tourist is Donald Duck, things don't necessarily go exactly according to plan. As Donald explores the area, mishaps happen that provide great visual humor. One of these examples is somehow Donald finds himself tangled up in some bread dough that someone is kneading for some sort of Peruvian bread. When I say kneading, I mean like rolling it, kneading. You know how baking works. The narrator says something about you can relax because even Donald is loafing around. I chuckled at that as I am a fan of puns, and I thought this pun is very clever because loafing around, loaf of bread, I'm sure you got it. There's also another segment in this short where Donald rides a llama across a suspension bridge. Donald gets scared, but the llama continues to act like a llama, not really caring about its surroundings, just expecting Donald to fix everything, and eventually ends up where the llama rides Donald across the bridge, but the bridge ended up having no planks, so Donald has to balance on the ropes that made up the bridge. This scene, as well as many other moments in this short, did a great job at teaching about the culture in the area and balanced it very well with some visual gags. The second scene is called Pedro, named after the plane who is the main character. Pedro is a baby plane whose father is a mail plane whose responsibility is to carry mail over the mountains. But one day the dad plane gets sick and Pedro takes it upon himself to make sure the mail can get delivered. In similar fashion to the first short, there is a narrator that interacts with Pedro and describes what is going on. This short is cute, granted, but I don't feel like there is anything necessarily special or noteworthy about it. There's nothing that really stands out about it. The animation of Pedro is fun, and I like some of the facial expressions that he was given, but it was never engaging in the same way the first short was. It's probably my least favorite short of this entire movie. The third short is titled, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this word incorrectly, but it's titled El Gaucho Goofy. This short describes a gaucho as an Argentinian-like cowboy. During the short, Goofy is taken from Texas to Argentina to help teach us about this Argentina cowboy as they describe it. I feel like this is the most educational portion of the movie. At first, we are taught how one of these gauchos dresses, with Goofy slowly getting dressed with typical gaucho fare, while labels appear on the screen telling you what each item of clothing is. Fun fact about this short, there was a director at Disney by the name of, I believe, Jack Kinney, who was developing an idea of animated shorts that followed Goofy giving instructions on common things, but kind of doing them incorrectly. One of those shorts was going to be titled How to Be a Cowboy, where we see Goofy do a bunch of cowboy things incorrectly. The idea of that short got combined with what they discovered about these gauchos, these Argentinian cowboys in Argentina, to come up with this short. One part I really liked in this scene, getting back to the actual scene, was a fact that I actually really enjoyed learning about, was that the saddles that they used for their horses could easily be transformed into a bed that they could sleep on. Since it is a cartoon, this point is exaggerated a little bit, with Goofy getting a mattress and a couple more blankets to put on top of the saddle. But once the horse hears the narrator say it can be turned into a bed, the horse flips around on its back and is now laying on Goofy. There are just a bunch of moments like that in this particular scene. The last one is actually the one that was most celebrated when it originally came out. It doesn't have a plot, but Donald returns and he meets Jose, who is the character based off that parrot I mentioned before. This one doesn't really have a hard plot like the other three, because the focus of this short is music, the music being popular samba music from Brazil, specifically the piece for which this short is named. The music didn't really stand out to me. I guess that style of music isn't for me, but I can definitely understand why this music has its appeal. But what I did love about this portion of the film were the visuals. As you can probably tell, the visuals are a very common theme of something I liked in this movie. The visuals in this specific short, though, were done in a watercolor type style, and they were very creative with how they played with the imagery. One moment that stands out for me above the rest is when banana bunches were kind of painted on the screen, and then on top of these bananas, there's like this weird black liquid that gets poured on them, and then the bananas turn into toucans with the actual bananas forming the beaks. I just thought that was a really cool thing to watch. Perhaps one of my biggest takeaways from watching Saludos Amigos is I feel like it really emphasizes for me how the greatest characters Disney has created are the Mickey and Pals gang. You know, like Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Goofy, Pluto. Donald and Goofy definitely are the standouts of this movie. And as I have mentioned previously, I have an ongoing list as I am rewatching all of these movies, a list of my favorite characters. So far, the characters have made that list are like Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio, Thumper from Bambi. I would put Donald and Goofy on this list, but I'm not really counting Donald or Goofy towards this list since they were created elsewhere and not like originally for this movie. Overall, 2 out of the 4 shorts I really enjoyed, the ones starring Donald and Goofy. One I liked, that last one I talked about that kind of had that watercolor styling to it. and the Pedro one I didn't really care for. Putting it all together, I liked about 3/4 of this movie, but none of those 3/4 were absolutely outstanding, love for me. Walt never really intended or had interest in making Saludos Amigos as simply a way to continue cash flow for the studio, and you can definitely tell. As far as my rankings of where I put this in my overall Disney movie rankings, I put it at number 4 out of 6. So right now it goes Dumbo, Snow White, Pinocchio, Saludos Amigos, Fantasia, and then Bambi. If there were moments in Saludos Amigos that I loved as much as like the first 20 minutes of Pinocchio, which I keep on talking about, it would probably be higher, since like as far as like a percentage standpoint, I liked like 75% of Saludos Amigos, where I only liked maybe 30% of Pinocchio. But that 30% of Pinocchio is an outstanding 20 minutes. And so I don't know when something's going to get above Pinocchio. We shall see very soon. But thank you for listening to this episode of This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. You can follow me on TikTok. I'm going to try my best to start posting more on there. You can follow TikTok, Instagram, and Threads at This Happy Place podcast. If you want to keep up with my rankings, you can follow me on this really cool app called Letterboxd, and my username on that is This Happy Place. If none of you know, or if you don't know much about Letterboxd, think about it as Goodreads for movies. If you've used Goodreads for books, Letterboxd is simply an app to help you track kind of like a film diary, but they also have this unique feature where you can create lists. And so right now, as I'm doing this series, I have a list of Walt Disney Animation Studios ranked, so you can keep up with all my rankings of the movies there. But thanks again for listening to this episode, and remember, there is a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.